Shalom, Chesed, and Bruchim Abayim. Peace, grace, and welcome to this special study based on Sukkah and its connection in the renewed covenant. My name's NeTzeR, and I'm glad to be participating with you all today. This is a very special study I love to do every year, dig a little deeper every year. Messiah and Sukkot, there's so many parallels here. One of the popular beliefs amongst the Messianic movement, those of us involved with the Messianic movement, are the possibilities of Messiah being born during Sukkot. There's so many great studies, but I'm going to focus on one in particular coming out of Acts 15. So let's get right into it. And Acts 15, very famous because this is the foundation of what to do with those who were not born Jewish and want to worship the God of Israel through the Anointed One, through the Messiah of Israel, Yeshua. So we see in the very beginning of Acts 15 that you have the emissaries, which is the 12 disciples of our Master Yeshua, or 11, unless you consider that Rav Shaul is stepping in the gap for the traitor. Rav Shaul, who was an enemy, is now a friend. Judas Iscariot, who was a friend, who turned his back. Either way, what we see is in the first few verses, some men came down from Judea and began teaching the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And when Shaul and Barnabas had great dissension and debate with them, the brethren determined that Shaul and Barnabas and some others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the emissaries and elders concerning this issue. Now, just a side note right there, you see that there's two groups here, the emissaries and elders. If you're looking at this 2,000 years from now, depending on what branch of the quote-unquote Christian world you're coming from, you're probably going to think, well, the elders, that is the elders of the quote-unquote church. But I would humbly disagree. Because we see who the other group that they're having a meeting with is. In verse 5, it says, but some of the sect of the Pharisees who had believed stood up, saying, it is necessary to circumcise them and to direct them to observe the Torah of Moses. So we have the emissaries of our Master Yeshua, the doers of the word, we'll just use that term for now, and some of the Pharisees that were favorable toward our Master. Remember, the separation that takes place between the two religions of Judaism and Christianity was something that developed over time. At this point in time, there wasn't such a distinction yet. So we have these two groups discussing what to do with non-Jews. Right now, it's all Jews. Jews from different schools of thought. And they're coming together as disciples of our Master Yeshua to decide what to do with these people from the nations. And look at the proof text that's given in verse 13. Read the whole chapter when you have a chance. There's so many different angles to study this portion. Very important for those of us who are disciples of Messiah Yeshua. In verse 13, it goes on to say, after they had stopped speaking, Yaakov, the brother of our Master, answered, saying, brethren, listen to me. Shimon Kefa has related how God first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name. With this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written. So this is the proof text that Yaakov, the just, the righteous, is quoting. And it says, after these things I will return, and I will rebuild the Sukkah, translated as tabernacle, of David, which has fallen. And I will rebuild its ruins, and I will restore it, so that the remnant of mankind may seek Adonai. And all the Gentiles who are called by my name says Adonai, who makes these things known from long ago. And we know the story. 7 particular beginner's commandments are given. You could categorize them differently. We could discuss that another time. But you're given the minimal requirement for those entering the covenants of Israel. The equivalent in biblical times of the Toshav, the Ger Toshav. In modern times, they call that the Ben Noach. In biblical times, it's the Ger Toshav. And so, what does this have to do with the Gentiles? Because this quote, the fallen tabernacle of David, obviously says, and those Gentiles who are called by my name. But we got to dig a little deeper. Let's go to the actual source that Yaakov HaTzadik is quoting from. And he's quoting from the prophet Amos, in chapter 9. If we could turn there, we can get into seeing what the Hebrew text has to say. And in verse 13, we find something peculiar. It says, it reads a little different. It says, in verse 11, depending on your translation, it says, in that day I will raise up the fallen Sukkah, or / booth or tabernacle of David, and wall up its breaches. I will also raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, declares Adonai, who does this. So the first thing that we got to understand is that Yaakov, and people could argue that even the authors of the Septuagint understood this, but I would argue that Yaakov is following the Torah and the prophets according to the older scribal tradition that is preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That is what the Greek Septuagint was based on. That's why sometimes you see some minor variations from the Masoretic text, which is what the modern Bibles are based on. But they're pretty much in line in the overwhelming majority of all passages, but there are some small variations. Anyways, Yaakov, the brother of our master, quotes this passage about Edom, which all of the different branches of Judaism that debated over various issues in the first century all understood that this is associated with the Romans. Edom is associated with Rome in some way, shape, or form. And here the renewed covenant clearly makes this association. The Gentiles who are taken out of Edom are the remnant of mankind. That's what the text says. We don't even have to go dig into much commentary to see that. So the idea is that now that there are Gentiles turning to the God of Israel in a massive movement, this has to do with this restoration of a remnant among the nations. And we ask the question, why is the language, the fallen Sukkah of David, applied to this event? So with that in mind, now that we have that understanding, we can turn to the next example. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, just to give a reference of other understandings on the passage of Amos, we see the following. In CD, in the community document here, column 7, it's of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it says, they should take care to act in accordance with the exact interpretation of the Torah, for the age of wickedness to keep apart from the sons of the pit, to abstain from wicked wealth which defiles, either by promise or by vow, and from the wealth of the temple, and from stealing from the poor, the Evyonim, of his people, making widows their spoil, and murdering orphans, to separate unclean from clean, and to differentiate between the holy and the common, to keep the Sabbath according to the exact interpretation, and the festivals, and the day of fasting, according to what was discovered by those who entered the renewal of the covenant, the Brit HaChadashah, in the land of Damascus. Very interesting. There's a group that is separated from the wicked priests that are the Sadducees, who are associated with the Herodians and the Romans and the traitors who are globalists and not being faithful to the God of Israel and the Jewish community. And these righteous men are exiled into Damascus and awaiting the renewal of the covenant. They enter the renewal of the covenant but are awaiting for something to be finalized in order for this to be sealed. And read further down a few columns, and it says, there shall come upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such as has not come since the day of Ephraim departed from Judah, when the two houses of Israel separated. Ephraim detached itself from Judah, and all the renegades of Israel separated. All the renegades were delivered up to the sword, but those who remained steadfast escaped to the land of the north, as was said in Amos 5:26-27. I will deport the Sikat of your king and the Kiyun of your images away from my tent to Damascus, away from my Sukkah. So this renewal of the covenant, they're using in a midrashic format. And we're just utilizing these first century and Jewish resources from that time period, from before and near the first century, to see what was the ideology of Amos chapter 9. And clearly this group of doers of the Torah were applying it to the renewal of the covenant and waiting for it to be set up by who they call, and I'm going to go and read. And the interpreter of the Torah who will come to Damascus, as it is written in Numbers 24:13, a star moves out of Yaakov, and a scepter arises out of Israel. The scepter is the prince of the whole congregation, and when he rises, he will destroy all the sons of Seth that escaped at the time of the first visitation. Very interesting language. In my humble opinion, this is a prophecy of the work of Messiah Yeshua and righteous Jewish people who were awaiting this to be fulfilled. This was the understanding. Now, it's not to say that we take anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or in the Talmud for that matter, to be equal to the word of Adonai. But these are the ideas of righteous Jews of the time period prior and following the life of Yeshua and his emissaries, and the events that occurred and are recorded in the renewed covenant. And this group awaited a renewal of the covenant, which has to do with the branches of Israel that were cut off. They call it Ephraim in a midrashic format, basically saying those who broke away. But what's interesting is that Yaakov, the brother of our master, is applying this to the Gentiles who are entering, not calling them quote-unquote members of the lost tribes, because that was already understood in Acts 6-8. We see that they're reaching out to Samaritans and Hellenist Jews who are assimilated into the Greco-Roman culture. So they understand the assimilated seed of Israel as being the focus of their ministry. But in Acts 15, the brother of our master is seeing that this also opens the door for an invitation of people from the Gentiles to join in this restoration work of Yeshua. And with that in mind, let's turn to a modern, well, not necessarily a modern, but a later idea preserved in Judaism that still reflects this idea. Keep in mind that the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls were mostly priests of the doers of the Torah, Osei HaTorah, the sons of light, they had different views than the Pharisees, but yet they all agree on this. The rabbis, the sages of our people, are disciples of the Pharisees. And so Abarbanel, commentating on these same passages, says the following. And if you say it will not be raised, as Amos said earlier, fallen and will not rise is the virgin of Israel, is the virgin daughter of Israel. This means she will not rise on her own and will not have a king from the other tribes. But now God will raise the Sukkah of David that fell in the days of Jeroboam, and will appoint a king from the house of David, King David, upon his people. And the fall of the house of David began during the temple era, when the splitting of the 10 tribes into a separate kingdom. And during the second temple, there was no king from the house of David. Rather, the Hasmoneans / Sadducees and Herod's house were the rulers. The Sadducees and the Herodians we find in the renewed covenant. Therefore, the prophet Amos says, I will mend its breaches. The breaches are the kings that the 10 tribes set up for themselves during the first temple era. Now this is getting interesting. Abarbanel, who is not a friend to the Christian world because he lived in Spain and Portugal and traveled to southern Italy and North Africa and the regions that the Sephardic Jews were being murdered and slaughtered by quote-unquote Christians for keeping Torah. Many of them believers in Yeshua as Messiah, who were murdered especially for their unification of faithfulness in Messiah Yeshua with observance of Torah. The people known as the Marranos. This is the time period that Abarbanel lived in. The great event known, not so great, but the very well-known event of the expulsion from Spain. Abarbanel lived during this entire period. And it's interesting to see that he doesn't shy away from the facts. He's a very honest commentator on scripture, whether you agree with him or not. He's letting us know that this passage has to do, the fallen Sukkah, keep in mind we're in the feast of Sukkot, entering in this time period, has to do with the restoration of the branches of Israel who were cut off. Now Isaiah 7:8 says, Yechat Ephraim me'am. Ephraim is cut off from the people of Israel, not Judah. So keep that in mind when you read passages such as Romans 11, where it says branches were cut off. It's not talking about the Jewish community. He starts off his midrash referring to Elijah the prophet when he was dealing with the northern kingdom and their worship of pagan gods. But like the Dead Sea Scrolls, they apply it to the sinners of the Jewish community in their generation in a midrashic level. So does Abarbanel. And who are these sinners? The Hasmoneans were the predecessors of the Sadducees in the time of Yeshua. They began to call themselves the Tzedokim. And the Herodians, who were basically their servants who rose up in power. They were forced to convert into their brand of Judaism. And when the Herodians, who were Edomites, rose up into power, they negotiated with the Romans a little more authority as their puppets, along with their frenemies, the Sadducees. So we see that there's a harmony between all these groups within the Jewish world. Abarbanel's quoting traditional understanding from the Pharisees that passed along into the rabbinic world. We see in the renewed covenant the disciples of our Master Yeshua understanding this, and also in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we're talking about the fallen Sukkah tabernacle has to do with the restoration of the branches of Israel who were cut off, And somehow this gives an opening for the Gentiles who want to renounce idolatry, renounce their separation from the covenants of Israel. Think of Ephesians chapter 2. You were dead in sin. You were of that identity. And now what happens at the advent of Mashiach in his first coming? What is his job? Just keep in mind one of the additional names of Sukkot, Chag HaAsif, the celebration or the feast of the ingathering. Asif has to do with collecting something from the outside and bringing it inside. And think of the name of Yosef, the role of Yeshua in his first coming. Yosef, as Rav Schneerson explains, where his name is given by his mother, Asaf Cherpati, he has taken away my reproach, Ve Yosef li ben Acher, and has added to me another son. In other words, Yosef, his name in the Torah represents being able to take away the shame of one who was connected as a son but is disconnected due to shame, but is also has the capacity to add another son. Exactly what we see here. We see that Yeshua, through his brother and disciples, is restoring those who were cut off and adding additional children to the family. So now with this in mind, let's continue to look into these beautiful passages of Scripture and go to Isaiah chapter 1. In Isaiah chapter 1, Isaiah is one of the most important books of prophecy, especially regarding the revelations in the renewed covenant. All of Scripture, of course, all of the Hebrew Scriptures, but especially Isaiah chapter 1. In verse 8, it says the following. The daughter of Zion is left like a sukkah in a vineyard, like a watchman's hut in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. Venotra bat Zion kesukah bekarem, ki meluna bemiksha keir NeTzeR. Pay attention to that final word there. As a city besieged is using a word that's very unique to Isaiah. NeTzeR. The root NeTzeR can mean a branch, an offshoot branch where something previously was maybe a stump, maybe a branch cut off and a sprout springs forth. Particular kind of branch, a young sapling. Or it can mean a guardian of something. In particular, we just went through this from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. We focus on the 13 attributes of mercy of Hashem, Exodus 34, verse 6 and 7. And the word's first appearance is in that passage, NeTzeR Chesed, which is the branch of grace, which they translated as mercy there, unfortunately, but it's grace, it's not rachamim. And it could also be the guardian of grace. Now, Rabbeinu Bachya explains that this branch or guardian of grace is Hashem's backup plan for the outcasts of Israel that have been cut off from the community. Meaning this is his extreme attribute of grace and mercy and all his favor for those who have absolutely no merit on their own. And with that understanding, now we can get into a little bit more of the role of Yeshua the Nazarene, or the branch of grace who restores the branches who were cut off. And where do we get that understanding from? Well, let's just go to the famous passage that I'm sure you've all heard. Isaiah 11. And what does it say in Isaiah 11? verse 1 and 2. Then a branch will spring forth from the stem of Jesse, and a NeTzeR from its roots will bear fruit. Then a branch will step forth from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from its roots will bear. And a branch from its roots will bear fruit. Let's listen to it in Hebrew because there's different versions. Might translate it differently. ויצא חוטר מגזע ישי, ונצר משורשיו יפרה. Once again, we see this word NeTzeR associated with the Sukkah. And here we have what is the circumstances that he springs forth. The stump of Jesse. There's a stump. A branch is cut off. What branch is that? Isaiah 7:8. Read it for yourself. Ephraim is cut off. Abarbanel says this. The Dead Sea Scrolls say this. Yaakov HaTzadik says this. Pretty universal understanding. Now, how does this affect those from the nations? We'll just read a little further in verse 12. What does it say in verse 12? And he will lift up a banner for the Gentiles and assemble the outcasts of Israel. Let's read that in Hebrew for a moment. V'nasa nes lagoyim ve'asaf nidchei Israel. So, like Yosef, who takes away the reproach of one who was forgotten from his father's house. Think of the two names of Yosef's children. Menashe, Nashani Mebeit Avi, forgotten of my father's house, as Abarbanel explains it in that manner. And Ephraim, I will multiply your fruit. Menashe is in the past tense singular, Ephraim is in the future tense plural. Again, here are the two groups of Mashiach in the role of Yosef. Restore those who were cut off gives an opportunity for those who want to join. A banner for the Gentiles, as those who are restored, like the Bnei Anusim, for example. This gives an opening for all mankind to come and join the family. As Yaakov the righteous, the brother of our master and leader of the movement once our master returns to the Father, established this as a case precedent in the works of the emissary, known as Acts, to certify that the work of our master not only opens the door of restoration for those who have been cut off, but opens the door for all mankind to join the covenants of Israel, as stated in Ephesians chapter 2. You who were far off are now brought close by the blood of Messiah into the commonwealth of Israel. So now, let's finish this verse. And I will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Unefutzot Yehuda yekabetz me'arba kanfot haaretz. Notice that the outcasts of Israel, the word that's used is nidachim. Abarbanel explains that these are people like the Bnei Anusim, the Jews of Spain, Portugal, and southern Italy who were cut off from the community and forced into Romanized Christianity, will return. But I say that this was already the case in the time of our Master Yeshua, as Abarbanel so nicely pointed out, as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were sinners in charge of the community at that time, and no, they were not the rabbis. They were the Sadducees and Herodians. I'm sure there was a lot of accomplices from all groups who were not faithful, but those were the two main groups who were associating themselves with the Romans. As we see in the book of John, they say that their loyalty is to Caesar, their only king, as they hand over our Master Yeshua. It's important to make the distinction that this is not the Pharisees. Gamliel in Acts chapter 5, verse 38 going down, clearly gives his voice to not go against the disciples of Yeshua. And as we know in early traditions of the disciples of Messiah, Gamliel was a friend of our master and there are many examples like Nakdimon, Nicodemus, and Yosef min Haramatayim, Joseph of Arimathea, which is actually a code for something. And I look forward to Rabbi Shapiro's book on Romans 11, because this passage that I just read from Isaiah 11:12 is actually quoted in Romans 11 as branches are cut off. Nidhu. This is speaking of the outcasts, in the same way that the Samaritans, the remnant of the northern kingdom mixed up with the Gentiles, are given an opportunity to return in Acts 6-8 through the work of Messiah. This gives the opportunity for the Gentiles to join as well. And that is Yaakov the righteous point in Acts chapter 15. But there's more. Now let's jump to the book of John, the good news according to Yochanan's testimony, in the well-known passage of chapter 7, and its association with Sukkot will make a little more sense now. Now, I really recommend digging into that chapter and giving it its own time and study, but I just want to focus on one verse, and you'll see why in a moment. In chapter 7, just with verse 10, what does it say? But when Yeshua's brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself went up, but not openly, but as in secret. Why would Yeshua the Nazarene go up in secret? Well, as Abarbanel and the Dead Sea Scrolls mention, who's in charge at the time of the temple? The Sadducees and the Herodians are those who are in charge. The friends of Rome, the enemies, the globalists, those who are not loyal to the people of Israel and the God of Israel and the Jewish community. These are the Hellenists. Now, there were Hellenists in the sense of people who lived in the exile, influenced by Greek and Roman culture, and they still tried to keep Torah and still love their people. That was one end of the spectrum, but the extreme end of the spectrum were those who were really embracing the Greek and Roman culture to the extent where they disregarded their own Jewish heritage and didn't appreciate it, and were more loyal to their own positions and wealth. And these were those who were being rebuked by the master and his emissaries. Same people that the Dead Sea Scrolls rebuke, and even the sages of Israel rebuke. It's very important to make that distinction, because unfortunately, one of the biggest lies told by Romanized Christianity is the quote-unquote misquoted and misinterpreted verses that blame the entire Jewish community for the death of our Master Yeshua, in the sense of betraying him, which is not true, because all of his disciples were Jewish and they were loyal to him. However, we are all guilty, because Mashiach had to suffer what he suffered for our sake. But going back to our study here and its connection with Sukkot, our Master Yeshua is going to fulfill a mission during Sukkot, but he has to move in secret. Let's continue working with this secret. If we go to chapter 11 of the testimony according to Yochanan, what does he say? In verse 45, it says, Therefore many of the people who had come to Miriam and saw what Yeshua had done, he raised Lazarus from the dead, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Yeshua had done. Therefore the chief priests, who are they? Sadducees, and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. Now a pause. Which was the Pharisee known to associate with the Sadducees, the high priest? His name is Rav Shaul. He was the enemy of the Messianic movement, who was not loyal and obedient to the instruction of Gamliel the elder, who was a good Pharisee who stood up and voted in favor of the Messianic movement. So this is something that I want to leave as a side note. It's not the Pharisees as a whole. As I stated, Gamliel himself, the Nasi of the generation, is in favor of the Messianic movement. And the Pharisee who was associated with the Sadducees, Rav Shaul, Paul, ends up repenting and being one of our greatest teachers and leaders of the movement. Continuing in verse 48, if we let him, referring to Yeshua, go on like this, then all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Prophetic moment. But one of them, at least they tried. This is prophecy about the replacement theology. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, a known Sadducee, you know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish. Wow. Now, he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Yeshua was going to die for the nation. Pause. A Sadducee, the group that is responsible for betraying our Master Yeshua, who no longer exists unless you count the Karaites as their offshoot, he's still used by the Spirit of the Most High to prophesy and acknowledges that Yeshua has to die for the nation. But wait, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one Bnei Elohim, the children of God who are scattered abroad. The children of God is a reference that we see in Parashat Noach, for example. All mankind was one. The first scattering takes place at the Tower of Babel. That's where there's a division between mankind. And so from that day on, they planned together to kill him. So what is the purpose of our Master's death? According to Scripture and not according to the traditions of men. It's in order to restore and secure the nation of Israel, the Jewish community, to cover them for the sins of that generation, that even the sages say the temple was destroyed for sinat chinam, for the baseless hatred of that generation. Our sages understand that completely. And it's also to gather in those who are scattered from the nations, who really belong with us, who their neshama wants to come back and be a part of the people of the Creator. So from that day, they planned to have him killed. Therefore, Yeshua no longer walked openly among the Jewish community, but went away from there to the country in the wilderness, into a town called Ephraim. And there he stayed with his disciples. Now, if we understand the midrashic application, the allegorical application of Ephraim, as we've explained through all of the previous examples, is speaking about, yes, in that time period, in that generation, first and foremost, to the assimilated seed of Israel, such as the Samaritans and Hellenists, but also to those from the nations who don't have to pretend to be from those tribes, but because of the restoration of the scattered seed, now have an opportunity to join as well, through the merit of the Messiah in the role of Yosef. And that is the picture that we see in this entire feast of Sukkot. And I'll give another example regarding this amazing event that Yeshua the Nazarene is fulfilling. But let's for a moment just go back to what we read of Yeshua having to make this trip to Jerusalem for Sukkot in secret. What was the purpose of him keeping secret from his brother? Yaakov, who's his brother? The same one that we see in Acts 15. What's the purpose of this secret? If we go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, in 1 QH, based on the Pesher on Habakkuk, in column 16, we see the following. I give you thanks, Adonai, because you have set me at the source of streams in a dry land, at the spring of water in a parched land, in a garden watered by channels, a plantation of cypress and elms together with cedars for your glory, trees of life in the secret source, hidden among all the trees at the water, which shall make a NeTzeR grow in an eternal plantation. Reading a little further down, it says, above it will rise all the trees at the water, for they will grow in their plantation, although they do not extend to the root, to the gully. Branches that are added, that are not originally from the root. However, he who causes the holy NeTzeR, the holy shoot branch, to grow in the true plantation, hides. He is not considered, nor is known. Its mystery is sealed. Now allow me to read that last part for you in Hebrew. Val yovel lo yishlechu shoresh umafriach NeTzeR kodesh lemataat emet soter belo nekshav ubelo noda chotam razo. The NeTzeR who restores all these fallen branches and adds and grafts in new branches is not going to be known. It's going to remain in secret. To who? To the Jewish community as a whole. Until what? Until the fullness of the Gentiles. Now, in order to understand a little better the fullness of the Gentiles, I highly recommend reading the Rivka Remnant by Rav Shapira, where he gives a good explanation about this, because there's a lot of confusion on this. People beginning to understand these connections, but going off into racial theories of lost tribes and not understanding. I'll just give one reference from the sages of Israel, from the rabbinic point of view, that this is a universal understanding that was held in the time of our master from different branches of Judaism. It says in Pesachim 87b, and Rav Eliezer said, the Holy One, blessed be he, exiled Israel, referring to the northern kingdom, among the Gentiles, only so that converts would join them, as it is stated in Hosea 2:25. And I will sow her to me into the land. Does a person sow a seah of grain for any other reason than to bring several core of grain during the harvest? And so this just so happens to be the same passage we see that Kepha, the emissary of our master Yeshua, quotes in 1 Peter chapter 2 verses 9 through 12. He quotes these passages based on Hosea chapter 1 and chapter 2 that are applied to Ephraim, and applies it to the Gentiles and calls them sojourners, residents and sojourners, gerim vetoshvim. The same thing that we see Yaakov, the righteous brother of our master, applying to the Gentiles in Acts 15. And this beautiful event began, this work began with our master Yeshua, but the fullness of it is when the nations, the remnant from the nations, make that return to Israel, as it is stated in Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 6. For there will be a day where the Nazarenes in the mount of Ephraim will call out, let us return to Zion, to our God. The literal reading of that, your translation may say watchmen or some other word. It's Netzarim Behar Ephraim, those offshoot branches and restored branches that are grafted in to where the tabernacle of David had fallen. As Abarbanel says, when the northern kingdom broke away, there was a breach. That breach needed to be restored and repaired. And our master Yeshua began that work and is doing that work through us even now, as we see the fullness of the nations being fulfilled. Simultaneously, this will provoke zealousness from the Jewish community. When they see the scattered seed of Israel returning with a multitude of sojourners from the nations who want to worship the God of Israel and keep his appointed times. But as it says in Zechariah 14, those from the nations who refuse to celebrate Sukkot will not receive the water from the heavens. In other words, they'll be cut off. The choice is yours. This time of Sukkot is a beautiful time of year where we come together. There's so much to discuss. We see this in Revelation chapter 7. Ephraim's not mentioned in the listing of the tribes, but yet we see the fullness of a Gentile multitude joining Israel, dressed in white, as is appropriate for the 7th month, according to the Jewish calendar. And what are they holding in their hands? Lulavim. The lulav, the 4 species, you can liken that to Romans 11, which comes back to Ezekiel 37, the 2 branches being placed together in your hand, like a lulav. There's so much symbolism used related to Sukkot in the work of our Master Yeshua that we wouldn't have time to fill it all right now. But this is a good start. Let's come into this celebration of Sukkot. All my brethren from India to Ethiopia to Sepharad to the Americas, from the north to the south, from the 4 corners of the world. Special greetings to Pastor Joseph and Pastor Joseph John, Pastor, and all the family.